The regional planes are tiny.
So yeah, people are popping in. Okay, that's great. So I'll just greet you all, and we're starting to set up here for our stream. And I must remember now. So tonight we're absolutely delighted to have with us Dr. Lindsay Earner-Byrne. She's the Senior Academic Leadership Initiative Chair in Irish Gender History at University College Cork, which is where I did my teacher training degree, so I am a slight alum. That's from there too. Her work basically intends to extend the boundaries of modern Irish history by highlighting the importance of the history of gender and class to the foundation and reality of the two states on the island of Ireland. Her first publications focused on the history of motherhood in Ireland, and she offered one of the first detailed historical considerations on the treatment of single mothers and their children in modern Ireland, which of course has been so topical, and we've covered a lot of that in some of our talks too. More recently now, she's exploring a history of Ireland from below, centering vulnerable and the marginalised in her work on life in 20th century Ireland. So this kind of ties in with some of the stuff we've been doing lately. So tonight she'll focus on her book, Letters of the Catholic Poor, Poverty in Independent Ireland between 1920 and 1940. And I should say, just before I left home last week, there was a documentary on TV about the widows of 1916, and Dr. Earner-Byrne had kind of been the MC and the head got the ball rolling on that. So it was great to see you talking to all the different people at home and those archives. Brilliant documentary. I love RTE for the documentaries they make.
Yeah.
So welcome, and thank you very much. I'll turn it over to you now. And so anyone who's online on the Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature down here to ask a question or chat even. I'll monitor that. And the same on YouTube, you can type in your comments. So let me just spotlight you, and I'll mute myself.
Great, thanks a million for that. I'm going to try and share my screen now while I'm talking to you, and I'll go into play from the start. So that's super great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Elizabeth, and it's a real honor to speak to you in New York. It's kind of weird to be doing this in my basement. It's 11 o'clock in Ireland in the evening. As Elizabeth was saying, I was recently involved in a documentary looking at what happened to the widows of those executed in the 1916 Rising. And one of the things that myself and the producer wanted to do was to use the story of these really well-known women and what happened to them after their husbands were executed as a way of exploring what happened to so many other widows, because of course it was really the decade of widowhood, wasn't it, between the Great War and the War of Independence and the Civil War and so on. Ireland had literally thousands of widows. And something that I'm happy to talk about after this paper in the questions is other source material that I've been looking at more recently, which has just been digitized online, which are the collection of military service pensions. And that's where you get all that widows material. So all of the executed, the widows of the executed leaders of the 1916 Rising have huge files in that collection, and they're online, and they're absolutely fascinating in terms of what happened to them and their children. By the way, if you hear a funny noise in the background, my dog is sleeping and occasionally snores loudly. So it isn't anything more than that. My apologies. I may have to shout at her to wake her up. So one of the things that I was interested in was sort of looking at what happened after independence. So in terms of, did life change for the most vulnerable? If it did change, in what way did it change? And for a long time, it was really hard to access that history. But while doing my first book on motherhood, I did stumble upon the archive of Archbishop Byrne. And this is an extensive collection of thousands of letters written to him by people from all over Ireland during between 1920 and 1940, which was the period that he was Archbishop of Dublin FAR. And these were, really, really very ordinary people, often having quite a lot of difficulty in expressing themselves on the page, grammatically and so on, but they were very eloquent. And at first I didn't know what to do with the archive, and it took me a while to realize what this actually meant. And that's what I want to discuss with you this evening a little bit, and show you some of that archive and talk about what I think it sort of amounts to. I don't know how familiar people are with the history of 20th century Ireland, but it's tended to be a narrative of political history, because the political history, of course, has been so exciting and so transformative. And as a result, you'll have lots of Irish historians telling you that Ireland was very poor, but kind of leaving it at that. It's sort of commented on, then it takes a back seat in the narrative. And the vast majority of people lived under what we would now term the poverty line, 50%. This was a period when you didn't have what we'd now call welfare transfers. And in fact, I think one of the other reasons why this history has been relatively neglected is because it is a history of class. And there is a very strong myth in Ireland, which pertains to this day. You will still hear politicians tell you today that Ireland does not have a class system, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's not a class system in a way that Britain has, but it's nonetheless a class system, and one that the poor themselves were very aware of. And you can see that actually even in the 1830s, when they're testifying to the Poor Law Commission, they're very well aware of the poor and with the gradations within the poor, and talk in terms of deserving and undeserving, even that early, even in the 1830s. So one of the things I was determined to do was to get at this class history, and this collection is one of the ways that I've done it. Now, in defining the poor, I put up just there a PowerPoint to sort of give you an idea of what I consider to be the poor, because I suppose it's the first question you deal with, who are the poor? And for me, they were people who were dependent on any form of relief or charity, either permanently or intermittently, to supplement their income. And the reason why I think intermittently is important is because the really big problem in Ireland was not so much unemployment as underemployment. So people who were seasonally employed or who were only employed for a period of time. And so they had to kind of put a patchwork of an existence together. Just like every other country in the world, women are much more susceptible to poverty. They continue to be so, largely because we have this breadwinner model where, we sort of expect, and certainly for much of the 20th century, there to be a male head that will earn enough of a wage to supplement and take care of the rest of the family, which of course means that widows are the most vulnerable in that kind of a social structure, and because they lose their breadwinner. And until 1935, there was no widow's pension in Ireland. And even when it was introduced, it was really very paltry. So widows really feature prominently in the records of poverty and in the discourse about poverty. Of course, also mothers with large families, and you've got uncontrolled fertility in Ireland, and no kind of regular practicing of birth control until the 1980s. And it really is until the 1980s that you see that family size decrease. One of my best friends in school had 17 siblings, and didn't know her 4 older siblings because they had emigrated before she really was aware of who they were. And when I tell my daughters that, who are now 18 and 14, they cannot believe it. But it was really within a generation when that just disappears. But still, Irish families tend to be larger than the European average, which is interesting. The other really big group that suffer from poverty are those with absent or unemployed fathers. Now, fathers could be absent because they've absconded, deserted, because they're ill, because they have emigrated, and sometimes they came upon hard times in emigration and were too ashamed to contact their family. And then the last would be single elderly women, because women tend to live longer than men, although interestingly not in Ireland prior to 1950. The death rate is equal between men and women, but you definitely have elderly women featuring more prominently among the poor, and I'm still trying to figure out why that was. I just put in some figures there for you to give you a sense of what you're talking about in terms of the proportion. So here you've got in 1931, there were 77,000 people in receipt of what was known as home assistance. And really all home assistance was the old outdoor relief. The new Irish state just changed the name. They changed, the workhouses were rechristened into county homes, and they were actually in the same buildings. And many of them are actually now local hospitals. And they renamed outdoor relief home assistance, much more benign sounding, but pretty much the same. And it was not a statutory payment, which I think is important. The only statutory payment that existed when the state was founded in 1920 was the old age pension, which of course was a gift from British rule, and one that the new Irish state was to cut really substantially in 1926, at the same time as increasing the salaries of all of those in government. And you can see here the proportion of those availing of something like home assistance. You have 15,000 men, but you've got like 24,000 women, and look at the number of children there, 37,000 children. And then just going even to 1940, when you still have home assistance, which is extraordinary really, You've got the same kind of a distribution happening in terms of numbers, a large number of children as well. After the 1940s, it changes, and I'm happy to kind of talk to that after the paper. But for now, that's the kind of picture I want you to hold in your head when I kind of talk to you a little bit about the sources. It isn't, by the way, that men were not susceptible to poverty. They were. And in fact, this period of the 1930s is the discovery of what becomes known as the able-bodied man, the able-bodied poor man. And that just tells you a lot about the psychology of poor relief and statutory services. And the able-bodied man comes out of the recession of the 30s, you know, which America would know even better than Ireland. And it changes the discourse on poor. So what I found really interesting is by the end of the 1930s, charities like the St. Vincent de Paul, which would have been the largest and still is one of the largest Catholic charities in Ireland, would start to talk about middle-class people slipping into poverty. And the word idle is no longer used. It's replaced with the word unemployed, which I think is really, really interesting. And it tells you about the story of unemployment changing in the 30s from one where, in a sense, the middle class can also become susceptible. And so the Vincent de Paul, actually, you have lots of people writing to the Archbishop saying, I used to be in the Vincent de Paul and now I'm receiving the Vincent de Paul. So the 30s is really that decade when I think the kind of understanding of unemployment moves away from the idea that you're responsible for your poverty into one that kind of understands poverty as a much more structural thing and something to do with the way the economy is set up. And I think if you track the language, you can see that kind of understanding of unemployment changing. What do we know actually about the poor, though, themselves? Because it's often, if you're trying to access poverty, you're often getting that through charitable records, right? So they're written by those people with money, and they're usually kind of pathologizing the poor, not always malignly by any means, but always in a kind of patronizing way. And there's always a distance between their narrative and the narrative of experience. So from a historian's point of view, it's very difficult to actually find records in which the poor tell their own story. And of course, like every source, even the one I'm going to talk to you about tonight, has its limitations, but it's nonetheless really rare to find records where the poor actually say, you know, this is what it's like from my perspective. So in order to access that history, I'm going to discuss this collection written to this man here, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Dr. Edward Byrne. And it's kind of convenient for us, and although they didn't do it on purpose, is in that he comes in with the new state, and he really oversees that state until the Second World War, which, as it would turn out within the history of welfare in Europe, is a very significant date, because it's really after the Second World War that you get the social welfare system that most Europeans are used to. So children's allowances, single mothers' allowances, all those kind of allowances come in the 40s. So in a sense, Byrne overseas, and this letter collection, these are the last Irish citizens who have no help as by way of rights, if you like, and any of the benefits and the assistance they get, they've got to negotiate, and that's going to change after 1940. So Byrne oversees this kind of transfer, which I think is quite interesting. I also found out after doing this that he was my great-grandfather's brother, which I didn't know while I was writing the book, which I'm not sure what that says about me as a historian, but there you go. Why I picked this picture of him, which I think is really interesting, and it tells you so much about the collection and so much about what's so really interesting about this collection, is this is a kind of a common devotional pamphlet that would have been given out. It would have been in a little pamphlet about the diocese, and somebody has clearly torn it out. And on the other side are prayers that Archbishop Byrne liked to say. And if you can see at the bottom of it there, it's, "My dear friend, I am 83 now." And why that's very interesting is this was an old man writing looking for charity, and the only thing he had to hand was the picture of Byrne himself. And he uses this picture of Byrne as a letter, as a way of begging. And that's one of the stories. The first thing that this collection tells me is the depth of poverty, because lots of people didn't have paper to write on. So you get these letters written on the insoles of shoes, backs of envelopes, children's copybooks, on the backs of bills, on the backs of envelopes, anything that they have to hand. And this is just one example, but to me it was a really I don't know, really poignant one. And you can see the shaking hand too. I find it quite interesting to kind of look at the topography of the hand. You can tell a lot about the kind of stress that people were under. So the letters in the collection, there's I counted them by hand because they weren't catalogued, and there's about 4,400 of them. And they come from every single county in Ireland, and they come from as far away as India and Australia, although the vast majority come from the immediate diocese that Byrne oversaw, which was also the poorest part of the country, with the exception of parts of Belfast, of course, no longer within the remit of the state at this point. But it's really interesting. So you get sort of a really wide collection of letters. They're, as I said to you, they're written in all sorts of forms of paper, and they're also written in all forms: pencil, crayon, pen. I even have one person trying to sketch what's tear the paper, but it was not a letter that I could make out. I wonder if the Archbishop had been able to do so. This is just a group shot I took to give you a sense of the way in which the collection was sorted. So if you can make out the pound symbols there on the top, you see those, and occasionally here in this one you can see a date. That's the only evidence I have as to how each of these letters were responded to. So the Archbishop's secretary would come in with the letters, I presume, at some point every week, and the Archbishop would dictate what he wanted done. And so the secretaries would often write actually on the letters. So on the flip side there, if there was going to be a longer letter written back, the draft of it would be written in some way on the actual letter itself, or the sum of money. It was usually just the sum of money. And the reason why I picked ones there with a pound and a pound, that was the average sum that a poor person would get. What's interesting is the more money you had, the more money you got. So if you were writing from an affluent suburb in Dublin as a widow who needed secondary school or boarding school fees for your children because your solicitor husband had died, you would get £200. You could get that much. One widow, over the course of her relationship with Archbishop Byrne, she wrote over 26 letters over the 20-year period. She received almost 1,000. So the sum for those in the upper echelons could be quite high, but anybody in working class areas would never get more than £1, which fits very much with the Church's philosophy that charity was never to change someone's status. That was not the intention. The other thing I like about this picture, because it tells you again so much, and one of the things that I tried to pay attention to in these letters was how the letters themselves told us a story about poverty. So you might see up at the top there, this woman's address is the front drawn room. Now what she means is the front drawing room, and that would have been a tenement building, probably in Henrietta Street, or one of those houses that had been, there during the Grafton's Parliament and had fallen into decline, and families would live in fact, often more than one family would live in a room, and so sometimes the addresses tell you something really quite graphic about poverty. This one I loved as well, because there were lots of characters who wrote to the Archbishop, and sometimes I would be laughing. I mean, a lot of the letters were very sad, but some of them were really very funny, and there were chancers. And Archbishop Byrne himself would occasionally write on the top, "No, rascal." And so he was quite capable of, and he had obviously a sense of humor himself. This one was written by a woman, a single woman who wrote regularly, and she had a cycle, and this is something that you could identify as well in the collection. She would do well for a few months, and because she worked in a hotel, and then she'd be let go outside the tourist season, and then she would pawn her waitressing outfit or costume, and then she would write at the same time every year asking Byrne to give her the money to release her costume from the pawn. And she always wrote in this fashion, very urgent, and here she is sending him a beautiful postcard of the Phoenix Park, and on the flip side, she tells him, sitting in a cafe, the hotel is reopening, I need to get back to work, I need my costume. And every year he would oblige, because one of the purposes of charity, one of the philosophies behind Byrne's charity anyway, and Catholic charity more broadly, was that you were supposed to be using this charity to put people back up on their feet. The idea was that people would not become long-term dependent, and in fact he wouldn't give charity to someone if he felt it was a hopeless case, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think, God, the more you need, the more you should get, but that's actually not at all the way it played out. So the collection is a really rich one, and the writers are often very eloquent. What did they write about and to the Archbishop, and how did they, I suppose, explain their situation? There were multiple types. I've just put this script up for you to have a look at while I'm talking about the sort of things that they wrote. For example, in 1924, Mr. John M. Now, just to say, I don't give the surnames in these collections in order to keep, some of these people's relatives may still be alive. He wrote from the heart of Dublin inner city, so in actually Coombe Street, a very, very poor part of Dublin where the maternity hospital is, in 1924, to say that he'd heard about the Archbishop's charitable kindness from a friend. Because one of the things I was really interested in is, how did they know Byrne was going to do this? Because the same collection doesn't exist under Walsh, the Archbishop that predeceased him. Now, I think he did receive charitable letters, but he didn't collect them or keep them in the way Byrne did. And I'm happy to talk about why I think Byrne was the one who collected these letters after the paper, if people are interested. But one of the things I looked for is, how do the poor strategize? Do they talk? Do they tell each other, I wrote to the Archbishop and it works, you should do it? And so some of them give away where they heard from it. Another gentleman writes and said, I spoke to a friend and he said that if I write to you only once, you'll give me some help. And which was not wrong, in the sense that one of the rules the Archbishop had was that he was a once off. And also that when you came to him, you had to have already tried everyone else. So you had to have been to the Vincent de Paul, you had to have exhausted your home assistance, you had to have a story that says he was really your last port of call. It's evident from reading these letters that the poor were reading newspapers and that the literacy levels were really quite high, even if the writing skills were patchy. And we do know that Ireland had reached 100% literacy, they say, by 1911, which is really impressive when compared to other European countries, and in particular female literacy. So, for example, women in Spain are not literate till 1960s, whereas in Ireland they're literate by the 1910s. And very few of the letters in this collection got someone to write the letter for them. Most of them were able to do it themselves. And as I say, spelling rivals many of my students. So they were really, even if they couldn't spell, they were so articulate. I mean, there's some of these letters are poetry, really. Mrs. Annie M, for example, explained that it was reports in the newspaper that had encouraged her to write. And this is one of the things that I found quite amusing. So often wills would be announced in the newspaper. And whenever somebody left their estate to Archbishop Byrne, which they did regularly, and I mean everything, thousands to him, that would be reported in the newspaper, and he'd get an avalanche of letters in response to it. So people were, capable of first of all, they were reading this stuff, and they were also able to say what the implications of that bequest might be for them if they wrote. Another woman, Mrs. Katie D, wrote in the 1930s saying, having seen the late bishop's will on this week's paper and his kind generosity to the poor, I thought I'd write and see if there might be something in it for me. Not surprisingly, many people claim to have received inspiration from God, and that is what propelled them to write. So, for example, Mr. Hugh O.N., an ex-national soldier, and many ex-national soldiers wrote because, of course, they found it very difficult to get work. He was a father of 3 very small children, he said, and he explained that many a man might do anything to get an honest living, and that he was almost driven mad, and he had gone onto his knees to say a novena, because his heart was so sad and broke, and I'm quoting him here, broke looking for something to do in regards to work. I prayed my novena, and then into my head came your vision of your face, and I thought, I will write you this letter. Of course, evoking religious inspiration served more than a mere explanation for writing. It simultaneously established religious credentials of these writers and put God in their corner, if you like. Mrs. Teresa MacG, for example, wrote that she knelt down in her small room in front of the Sacred Heart picture to ask God to direct me where to turn my thoughts, and they turned to your holy house. By drawing on such imagery, they evoked biblical promises of God's protection of the poor and the sinner. And this letter here by Patrick H. from Balbriggan, who wrote seeking help to clear his £30 gambling debt, enveloped his entire letter in religious imagery. So I'll just read it because I think if you can hear it, and actually performing these was really pivotal for me in understanding and actually seeing that a lot of these people are talking to the page. It's really oral writing that you're experiencing. It goes very hard with me to have to write you this letter. That's really common. this, and because it fits in with that idea of being respectable poor, you know, this is a shame for me to do it and I'm doing it because I'm desperate. I'm in great trouble and on the verge of despair. Your saintly face gave me strength today and told me to write to you. I will start a new life over and never again do what I have done. Send me some little medal to keep me from temptation, and our household will always remember you in our prayers of how you saved us. But you do not need prayers, as you are already a saint. Knowing you will love me, and I will pledge myself to lead a good, God-fearing life from now on and repay. Interestingly and unusually, Patrick's pitch was effective, and he was given the £30, which was a huge sum to be given, and to be given to somebody with a gambling habit, particularly as the Catholic Church was really railing against gambling at this time, and gambling was a serious problem for poor households, and a cause of quite a lot of distress. But the crucial thing for Patrick was that he got his parish priest to vouch for him and to say that he believed he had been cured through prayer, and that this £30 would be an investment. We can't know to what degree Patrick believed in religious inspiration and the power of medals to ward off temptation. Many people certainly did. However, it's clear from his letter that these ideas had a powerful social resonance and helped Patrick to frame his failings in a culture of religious redemption, which is quite interesting, as I say, when his failing was a particularly antisocial one, that in a sense, pulling God into that helped people with those kind of problems we now have a much greater understanding of, to actually get some kind of a sympathetic hearing. Now, as I said, by 1911, Ireland had attained almost complete adult literacy. And in 1926, so only 4 years after the new Irish Free State was formed, it made primary education between the ages of 6 and 14 obligatory, which was quite a significant move and quite a hardship for many working class homes, because many homes relied on children's labour. There was a clause in that bill allowing rural children to have many more days of absence without the school inspectors being called in. So there was an understanding of the rural economy as something different to the urban one. But I think still a lot of children missed quite a significant amount of school, and there weren't anywhere near enough inspectors. There still aren't, to keep an eye on that. However, the one thing this collection really does indicate to us is that these children, even those who had really poor literacy in terms of punctuation and spelling, they knew how to write a letter. So even the most poorly literate knew where to put the address and knew what the form of the letter would be, and kind of approximated what that looked like. And if you, just to show you with this letter, so I've already kind of shown you on this how Patrick's spelling was poor, absolutely no punctuation, but look at his writing, really quite good. And there, as you can see, the £30 on the top, which indicates what he was given. But his writing doesn't fit at all with his grammar. And so one thing I can tell you is, and it was true in my education, the nuns and the brothers were really strict about your joined handwriting. And that's the one thing that seemed to have stuck. And it really marks out Irish letter collections to this, for example, their British counterparts. And I've looked at ones in Germany and Italy, and the standard of writing is much, much poorer. And that's something that really marks this collection out. And I found that quite interesting myself when I was going through it and comparing it with their international competitors. So many of these actually are operating on a subliterate level. They have phonetic spelling, little punctuation, and they often don't order their writing in a literal way. They order their writing in an oral way. They're much closer to that oral tradition. And that's why reading them, there were some letters I couldn't understand when I read them in my head, but when I read them aloud, I could understand them. And the other thing that was great, and I've done this with students in class, is that certain letters, if you read them aloud, you can hear the accent. So temptation, for example, he writes there. And then you have Dublin ones that are called the Archbishop, and they don't end it. They don't put their T's on or their H's. So it's quite interesting, because you can actually literally, it's a rare thing to be able to hear a source. In 1937, here, Mary MacD wrote in quite a childlike script a letter that displays many of these traits of oral writing. Her letter has no paragraph breaks, virtually no punctuation or space. The spacing on the page is quite poor. She misjudges, so she's got to squash her writing up at the end. So you can tell these people are not used to using a page in a kind of schematic way. But listen to what she tells the Archbishop, and how even in the literary form, you can get a sense of what's important to her. His Grace, the Lord Archbishop, so she gets that right. It's on a sentence on its own, and then comes the letter. May God bless you and share and spared your health for a very long time yet. I am always praying for you. And I know you 30 years when you were a curate in the Pro Cathedral in Marlborough Street. I used to go to confession. I am 30 years in the one sodality. I am always at the mission every year. I do walk to see you home to the palace. Myself and my husband do be delighted to see you home. That's a reference to the fact that they would know when he was in the palace because his car would be outside. The Most Reverend E.J. Byrne, and last week I buried my baby girl, 5 months old, from the Children's Hospital. We got no society money because she was not 13 weeks in benefit. So my husband pledged his clothes and boots to help to bury it. So I just wrote this letter to know, could you give me some help to get his clothes and boots out of the pawn as he's going to work next Monday? Please, God, please do your best to help me. For God's sake, don't let me down, for he is in a bad way for his clothes and boots, and all I'm getting is 16 and 6 per week labour exchange to keep 3 in family. Please do your best to help me, and may God bless you. You will always be in my prayer, and also our Pope. Yours, Mary MacD. Mary MacD's order may not be incidental, but central to her plea. She may very well have judged this structure to be the most effective way of appealing if we think about it. First, she establishes a personal connection. I knew you before you became Archbishop, and I'm always watching over you, and I know when you're in your palace. I know when you're in our home district, if you like. And then she gets to the real nub of it, which is the death of this little baby. And she doesn't even have pause for time about that grief. It's about the fact that the baby didn't live long enough for them to have been paid, which is the one thing the poor always paid, 1 shilling a week for burial, for this burial society, so that their children didn't have a pauper's burial. That was really important. And every one of the letters will always, when they're giving you their budget, and one of the things they all do in these letters is give their budget, and they'll always put in the society money. And this little baby didn't live long enough to qualify. And she puts that in the middle of the plea, and then goes to the husband and what he had to do, which is pawning everything. And then the real reason why she needs it back is so that he can get back out there and work for the family. So, and she goes back then into, and we'll pray for you and for our Pope. So I think actually you can tell a lot from these subliterate letters, almost more, I think, about the emotional power of what they're trying to say than the more literate who kind of fall back on stylistic forms of writing that obscure emotion, I think, more than maybe this form of writing does. I think also, while the purpose of this letter was not to elicit sympathy, and I think that's really interesting for her bereavement, the idea that a family had no pause for grief because of greater financial pressures was a powerful reminder of the depth and cost of poverty. Mary MacD's structure, I think, graphically highlights this fact for the modern reader. She didn't open her letter with the death of her child because in and of itself, it was a relatively common occurrence. In Mrs. MacD's part of Dublin, infant mortality rates were the highest in the country at 109 per 1,000 births in 1937, which is really high. And if you compare that death rate with Blackrock, which was less than 15 kilometres away, you're looking at a death rate of maybe 20, so much, much smaller. So really, poverty really can be counted in babies' lives. These charities letters, I think, offer the historian much more than a mere account of the give and take of charity. To get successfully, a writer needs to be able to employ the social skills of a negotiator and all the cultural savvy of a poet. They need to know what references to pull on, what the letter writers wanted and how they asked for it. There are many asides and rhetorical flourishes, I think, tell us quite a lot about their understanding of poverty, but more broadly, the way in which they understand the universe in which they've got to operate. The vast majority, for example, are really quick to express their fidelity to the Roman Catholic Church, their sobriety, their willingness to work. And crucially, they offer reassurances that this is not long-term. They won't be a burden, as in MacD's case. Just give my husband back his boots and he'll be on his way to working for the family. And they're very aware of exactly what charities are going to ask for in terms of the deserving poor. And here's your kind of list here in terms of what was deemed to be deserving. And you've got a writer here. So I do not smoke or drink. As regards to work, I do not care what kind of work, hard or soft. I'm the right kind of man. In reality, the idea that most applicants to charity had ever been stable on their own financial feet was an illusion. How could it have been in a labour market that relied on casual labour and cast workers aside at a moment's notice? Nevertheless, the poor knew that they could be easily tagged as a nuisance, and that the line between proving you were in need and convincing those in authority that you were not fatally so was a very fine line indeed. The religious authorities' long-standing fear of religious defection, however, proved to be really useful ammunition for many of these writers. The only thing many of them had to barter with was their souls. And the fact that it was a particularly successful ploy reflects the level of religious anxiety in the newly independent state, which I find really interesting. This was an overwhelming majority church. And yet, if you threaten to go to the Protestants, you're guaranteed success. Many of these letters represent, I think, acts of individual protest embedded in a value system that the poor actively engaged with, allowing them to make calls upon it and to assert their rights within it. And I'll show you what I mean. This woman here, look at this. Okay, so Miss Penny C, she writes in 1938. Look at that for writing, okay? Barely able to, I mean, well, actually her Zs are quite nice, but she's writing it with the crayon on the back of, it's actually the kind of last page of a copybook. It's that kind of shiny paper. And how poetic it is. She's furious that her husband's request for charity has been refused. And even though her literary skills are pretty limited, her kind of psychological ones are very, very sharp, because in this letter, she's able to reduce that complex world of religious manipulation right down to its bare essentials. So you can see here, she starts, is this a civilized country? My husband went up on Thursday to the palace, and Father Glennon gave him your card to get signed by Father Boylan, and he refused to give an answer. So this is the system. You go up, you get a card, you had to get it signed by the parish priest who vouched for you. And clearly in this case, the parish priest did not cooperate. But here's the killer sentence. I can see now that religion is only a cloak. What matters what side you're on once you've enough to eat? And that really just stopped me in my tracks when I read it, because she's really, I expected to find obsequious letters where people were constantly, doffing the cap. But in fact, quite a lot of them, and particularly women, are furious. We've had children for the church. We've done everything we're supposed to do for the church, and you're leaving us die of hunger. And they are not taking this quietly. And that was a real shock to me when I looked at the archive. In 1935, Mrs. B from Kimmage, and here again is lovely handwriting, wrote as a Catholic mother of an unemployed husband with 9 children. So she gets that in straight away. That's my credential. That's my claim on you. I have 9 children. Who was unable to secure clothes for her children from Catholic charities. My children are like little pagans, don't know what school or chapel is, owing to being barefooted and naked in clothes. Evoking the pathos of motherhood, Mrs. B blatantly attempted to implicate her church as the bystander to her poverty. And she says, it's very hard to look at your own children half-starved and naked, and to know that in such a distressed case that your own religion could help. Well, Reverend Father, what am I to do? Put them into schools for the sake of trying to please the people who by the word of God is placed in a position to help their flock? Should I take myself and my family to another religion? And they to know the distress plight I was in and wonder what the Catholics would say. And she was successful. So the thing that the church really feared, and one of the very big roles that women had, apart from having children regularly as God would send them, was sending those children to Catholic schools. And this was a campaign that the Catholic Church had been working on since the 19th century. So threatened to send them to Protestant schools, and all hell broke out. So she's threatening to take her children to a Protestant school. But interestingly, she's saying, and it's not me that should be embarrassed by this prospect, but you, which I think is really quite sophisticated. However, she ends her letter by saying, well, Archbishop, there are many temptations where there is such poverty, and my letter can bear any investigation. Yours obediently. Well, she's no more his obediently than the next, but nonetheless, it doesn't seem to stand in her way. Few expressed, however, their rage, I'm coming to the end now, their sense of rage with the new order, as much as this writer, Edward, in 1933. He wrote from Donnycarney, which was a new kind of suburban housing estate, kind of an experiment, which didn't really work out very well because they didn't plan it. There wasn't good transport, and there wasn't the support network or the charities, indeed, that these people had when they lived in the inner city. And he writes after being laid off from a good job in flour mills. And he's driven, and he says, to voice his grievance, which is afflicting many honest a worker, and that is the use of electrical power. It's fascinating. And he writes this letter, means railing against modernity and how the labourer is losing their jobs. And it goes on, 6 A4 pages. And it's a manifesto for James Connolly against the elite and the hypocrisy of Catholicism. But it is also a really searing indictment on a country in which it is impossible to move upwards, because effectively he's scrimped and saved to get this house on Donecarney, and he's about to lose it, and he does lose it. I know from other letters later. But he writes, I've lived in the slum of Dublin for the best part of my married life, during which time God sent along 5 children. I was heartbroken because I hadn't a decent home to receive them into, but I worked hard, struggled, saved. In the end, I succeeded in getting a decent home, building up a Catholic Christian home. But alas, it is to be ruined by the use of social services against me, so that my former employer may increase his already huge profit. I have this house from the Dublin Corporation on a tenant purchase scheme, but due to the loss of income, I cannot pay my weekly instalments. And what does all this mean? Well, if I may answer what I see, it means going back to the slums. And he has that underlined. After I spending a life saving trying to get out of them, that right of private property shall never be mine, nor the right of any of my class. So really, really interesting and eloquent indictment. And he goes on to say how it is impossible to raise oneself out of the gutters honestly, and that one can only do it in a dishonest way. And I think he revealed a really deep understanding of the complexities of his society. He was able to raise questions about religious hypocrisy because he talked about the Catholics waving their flag at the Eucharistic Congress of 1932. And he was able to point to state responsibility and its failings in terms of both the housing market, and that's still happening, but also in terms of the responsibility for these children for whom there was no choice. I mean, birth control was against the law, so there was no option but to have these children. And he did, as I say, ultimately lose his house. In the end, I suppose, how am I doing, Elizabeth, for time? Should I wrap up? Yeah, okay. Just to end then with what I think these letters are, what message they give to us, I suppose, and much of this, I must say, I think endures to the current day. And that is, poor people had no sense of financial security or of possession. They couldn't plan for a future. They couldn't count on keeping what they did own, because they had to, their whole bartering system meant the pawn, even what you owned was always temporary. And they couldn't safely put down roots. That's the one thing I would find the same one person writing from multiple different locations, because they had to move all the time to get a better rent. The toll this life exacted is catalogued in letter after letter. These letters do not record passive acceptance or numbed existence. They bear witness instead to the fact that people were aware of the disadvantages they suffered and the many consequences of poverty long before social reformers were articulating them. Hundreds of letters made the connection, for example, between poverty and physical ill health and mental anguish and stress. And I find that really interesting, because you don't have doctors. Malnutrition isn't understood till the 1920s and 1930s. And you don't have doctors talking about mental stress until much later in that century. CR, for example, wrote a short letter in the 1930s from a hostel for homeless men in Dublin, encapsulating the vicious and complex health-poverty cycle. He was writing for help to retrieve his clothes from the pawn so he could enter a sanatorium to be treated for tuberculosis, which had caused his poverty, which had led to his pawning, which had led to his request. The very rhythm of his letter, and I have a small section of it here, and you'll notice he got tuberculosis right, which is really interesting, because I think they get the spelling of all these diseases from med certificates, because they never get the medical illnesses wrong, even when they're difficult to spell. Dear Father, so listen to the rhythm. Dear Father, my health has broken down. I'm suffering from tuberculosis of the lung and have not been able to work for some time past. Dear Father, owing to my ill health, but not being able to work, I had to pawn my clothes and boots for food. I ask you, dear Father, if in the name of God you can give me any help to redeem them, as I'm going away to the sanatorium. And dear Father, I cannot go away unless I redeem them. So you can actually, in the letter, that circle that he's trapped in is literally performed. I find it fascinating. Tuberculosis was still endemic in Ireland at the time, and there wasn't effective treatment until the 1950s. And he asks for £2 to redeem his clothes, and he ends his letter saying, I hope God gives you at least health and strength. And he does get his money. The mental stress of poverty was rarely considered by contemporaries who wrote about the poor. However, those who lived in persistent poverty often articulated this mental strain. The letters to the Archbishop of Dublin record the symptoms of what we would now recognise as profound stress and depression as a result of a sense of impotence and relentlessness. They're exhausted, not just of poverty, but of what poverty forces them to do, to constantly tell these stories about themselves to multiple charities. While the language tended to be less precise or scientific when describing mental health problems, than when writing about physical health. The idea that stress and anxiety were caused by poverty and led to mental illness was clear and consistently recorded. So, for example, a mother of 7, Mrs. Agnes L., lamented that she was worried to death trying to make ends meet. Margaret C. provided a really vivid description of ongoing stress when she wrote, "I'm really distracted and I'm afraid my brain will snap. I can't sleep at night. I only worry all the time and trying to be brave and do my duty here, but there's no sleep." And I can just feel what it's like when you can't sleep. A mother of 9 from the island of Guernsey, County Waterford, warned that she couldn't bear anymore and felt her brain burning out with trouble. She had written twice before and received no reply. And in her last letter, she ends with, "Am I such a mere nothing?" which really sort of struck me as a really sad kind of call from the archive. If families were supposed to and did rely on each other for financial support, they were often also forced to scatter themselves in times of crisis in order to survive. In Ireland, it wasn't uncommon for families to break up, either because of institutionalization of children or the emigration of a spouse, and indeed children in search of work. Many of the letters to the Archbishop record the emotional and practical implications of this strategy. So spouses who emigrate in search of work don't return, or others get stuck where they emigrate to and need help to be repatriated. And others still sorely miss their loved ones. And children are stuck in orphanages and industrial schools. And that's routine. The people will put their children in orphanage because they've got no choice. Ultimately, of course, the most common price of poverty was dignity. The system itself cost people their pride, their sense of self, and in many respects, it helped to maintain the social inequality that relegated these people to the margins in the first place. Some were resigned to it, others worn out by it, and many angered by it. Some wrote in acceptance of the monitoring that was required, having to prove and be investigated. Others were hurt by the distrust, but all were stung by humiliation. Thank you very much. I don't know if I've gone way over time, Elizabeth, but...
No, that was amazing. I think we have us all spellbound. God, it is absolutely tragic, isn't it? I'm glad you mentioned dignity there. I think that's what was going through my head too as I was listening to you, like that, my God, they just leave them with nothing,
Yeah.
And I put down some notes and then we'll take questions. I know Megan asked, I'm in the wrong thing. She said, "This is amazing. Will these digitized items be accessible on the internet?" So I suppose not really, like the power, this thing where we've taped this and this will be on our website, Megan. So like you'll be able to kind of look at the snippets of letters. Obviously, a lot of them might be reproduced in the book, so you can look at them.
Yeah, but they're not, Megan, but the military service pensions have very similar letters in the collection, and they are available. And I was looking at one today. I was just saying that to a friend, and this was a woman whose husband was shot on the second day of the rising, and she writes in 1923 with 3 children, looking for a pension, and she died in 1928. So only the husband died in 1916, so she dies 12 years after, leaving the children orphaned. The youngest is 14, I think, of tuberculosis and effectively of poverty, and so those files are, to me, lots of people are looking at them from the point of view of the revolution, but to me they're really interesting from a social history point of view.
Okay. So what did you call those again? The
military service pension collections.
Yeah,
so I mean, if anybody wants to email me, my email address is up on the university webpage, and I can give Megan that link if she's interested in it, and she can have a look. And they're very kind of accessible, but it's a wonderful resource.
Yeah, and relatively new, I think, some of that digitization, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're releasing lots all the time, but at the moment there are thousands of them. I mean, it will take a decade to get through them.
But it's amazing, it's even, as you said, to use the same sources, but for kind of a different story.
Yeah.
Because we are so used to hearing about the men and the war and what did you do and how did you smuggle the guns, Megan says she's grateful for the good handwriting. Me too, beautiful. So, I mean, I said here, it's interesting, when I was at home, we did a little snippet of Sive for a night at the museum, and John B. Keane talks about that when you were talking about the elderly women as a group on their own, how vulnerable kind of they are. And that's mentioned in a lot of rural Irish writing, that this threat to put them into the home, because you could be kicked out of your own house. And even the marital rates in Ireland, we have a very older population sometimes getting married because they have to wait, before they can get married, which is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the average age for women was 26 and men 29, which is really old. And if you think about life expectancy was 52, 53. So, it was old. And I think a lot of that, it is, you're right, it is having to wait, but it is also the knowledge that you will have as many babies after that. As will come your way. So, you want to be sure you can afford them. And I think, and that was the church did a lot of hard work in instilling that in people in the 19th century, because they didn't want early marriage and poverty. So they tried to and then they did too much, and they had to roll back on that message, because then there weren't enough people marrying.
Well, that's it. My own maternal grandparents, like my nana was one of 11 in Limerick City. Her father worked off and on, I think, for the American Merchant Navy or whatever they're called. And my maternal grandfather was one of 14. And like the father was much older. He was disinherited from a big farm because he married a servant girl who he found through she wasn't even in Kerry, she was in Waterford. He found through a priest somehow. And she was only 17 getting married, and they had 14 kids, so very tough.
But even that class story is interesting that you're saying there, that one of the ways families really did punish people for marrying outside the class. And I think class is a really underdeveloped narrative in Irish history. And to me, it's almost more important than gender in terms of shaping people's life opportunities.
Yeah. Well, and especially as you said, they're aware of it themselves. That man never really worked a day in his life. My great-grandfather, apparently, he was able somehow to keep a horse and a violin. And for a little while, he was a gate lodge, he was a kind of a games keeper on a big estate for a lord in Waterford. And he refused to doff his cap to the guy when he opened and closed the gate, because he said, sure, my own farm in Kerry is as big. But he had been disinherited, so he lost that job, and they had to come back to Kerry, and they lived, in very poor housing. And every now and then the grandmother would send in food from the farm, but they had no contact, with the family. It's amazing. So I saw it too. I love the writing, and Megan raised this. First of all, I thought it was quite a high standard of persuasive rhetoric in a way. They definitely know who their audience is, and how to structure. But I found I was doing research in the 19th century in the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick over here, and it was kind of the same thing. They would give them a card, and one woman, and you could see the same people coming back, maybe they'd had another baby, so there was that kind of expense for a little while, or the husband had been let off his seasonal job. But the guy, he was a lawyer in the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, and he wrote on the card, "She tells a good story, give her 10." So they do make these kind of personal,
they do. It's interesting. Everybody knows what dance they're involved in.
And I thought that the fantastic vocabulary, they clearly do have that kind of, in a way, a classical education almost, with little bits of reference to Latin
and a capacity to see the way the system works and to call it out.
I thought that guy was amazing, because you could see the temper, he'd underlined things. The one thing I wanted to ask you, and so you did bring up that guy, but before you had him, I said, isn't it amazing that they're not more resentful of the church? So that woman that, I'm so delighted to see you getting in safe to your palace. What happened to the vow of poverty? You don't see that kind of backlash.
But you do have the way in which I think that you do have some writing saying, particularly families who've been disinherited and want their money back from the Archbishop, and they don't get it. But you had the most common way in which that's expressed is through defection. What's the point of you? So I'll go to the other side. And interestingly, I looked at entirely Protestant letter collections, and if you threatened to defect as a Protestant, you got cut off. Didn't work. Which is counterintuitive. I would have thought it would be the other way around. But it really, the kind of this idea of the souls, these children's souls, that's really what motivated them, And you do have some single mothers. Single mothers writing.
Them to have the babies, and then very little.
And they've no problem with them going to institutions, because one of the things that I found was that if somebody would write and say, we need help, we need this amount of money, if the priest wrote and said, here now, I've told them that I'll take 3 of those children to the industrial school and they're just refusing, the Archbishop will say, well, then no money. So often getting some kind of help will be contingent on handing those children over. And of course, once the children were handed over, that's where they stayed till they were 16. We know that. So that, and in terms of
the church then to run those homes.
No, it's and it was very conscious. I mean, I've done work on the industrial schools in another context, and when they're introducing the Children's Bill in 1941, and one of the clauses is about releasing children from the institutions if they've been committed to an industrial school. On what grounds can they be released? And somebody wanted at that point, you had to have the signature of both parents. And this was a real problem. If one parent died or one parent deserted, the other parent could never get the child back. And the Minister for Education, when he was asked about changing that, he said, what? And put these industrial schools out of business? No. And there was no question. Nobody in the Parliament raised a question about the fact that, and the idea to me too, that you would pay these per capita for these children to be in the industrial schools, but you wouldn't pay that money to the families.
Yeah. God, yeah. And what are we going to say about single mothers from the church as well?
Yeah, a lot of them would write as well and say, you know, if you want me to not give this child to Protestants, you better give me some money. And they would get it.
Yeah, they would get it. They would, of course.
And big sums there, you know, as in £50 and stuff like that, substantial sums. But also one thing I discovered through this collection as well is that the single mother prior to 1952, before the introduction of state adoption, the mothers paid to have their babies adopted. It was not the adoptee. So the families adopting didn't pay. The mothers did, and they paid up to £35. The going rate in the 1920s was £35 to have the baby taken off your hands, as they put it, and adopted out to other families. And that was something that historians didn't know until I saw this collection. I have multiple examples of mothers having to try and raise this sum of money in order to have the children taken permanently and adopted.
I was going to ask you, was that kind of done exclusively by wealthy women, you know, that they had that option? And no, but it was people scrambling. Wow.
Yeah.
It's shocking. Yeah. Megan was saying, I wonder, do we even know the relative value of a pound at the time? Yeah, like what would be
well, you'd be saying now, so yeah, I can tell you. So an average labourer would have made about £1.50, £2 a week. Wow. So it's about half of a labourer's wage at the time a week. Yeah. Now, a school teacher would have made about £160 a year. Okay. But the Taoiseach, so the Prime Minister, made £2,500.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and they didn't pay tax. It was 5% tax, but you had to earn a huge amount to pay any tax. And it wasn't until De Valera came in 1932 when he halved his own salary.
Wow.
Because he just felt he couldn't stand over it.
Yeah. Something I like about De Valera.
Yeah, well, I was like, okay, that's a score for Dev there.
Yeah, exactly. That's so funny. We had another couple of questions there. Megan says, thank you. She said that she was amazed by the near 100% adult literacy rate in 1911. Was this achieved through education at home or collective schools? I'd say the primary school system.
It was the primary schools. So Megan, one of the few perks of having the British in Ireland for that long was that they had introduced free national school system in the 1830s before they did in Britain. So it didn't come into Britain until the 1880s, and in Scotland, Scotland was earlier. Britain's in the 1880s and 1890s. So they experimented in Ireland, and they thought if they introduced an education system, that would teach Irish children in English. So it was a real death knell for the Irish language, but also non-denominational. So the idea was that religion would not be taught in these schools. And of course, the Irish realized straight away what these schools offered them, and that was a passage to America, because they could get their kids educated speaking English. And you can see, if you look at the first manuals for education in the 1830s, the very first thing they're teaching people is to write a letter once they've emigrated home to send the money back. So they trained these children for export from the get-go. And that's why we have some of the best letter collections in the world come from Irish migrants, because they knew straight away what this commodity was. They could be the most literate workforce in America and Australia and the other countries that they were likely to go to. So they saw education. And interestingly, women were more likely to go to school than men, because there was less value to have a girl at home because of the rural economy. So you'd be more likely to keep a boy at home to labour, and you can actually track it. So wherever there's a factory, a girl is less likely to go to school because their parents could send her there. So you can just see how the families were strategizing. But as a result, Irish women, because Ireland was so rural and there was so little work, when the textile industry collapsed in the 1850s, it wasn't replaced by any form of employment for women. And so, except entering the convent, which they did in their droves. And the other option was to get yourself fluent in English and writing and out, and that's what they did. So they sent their girls, they prioritized female education. Also, because they figured out that girls were much more likely to stay in touch and send money home. So it was a much better investment to educate your daughter and send her off to emigrate, because you were much likely, your son was more likely to disappear.
Yeah.
And I think that the figures are quite remarkable. Like out of every 6 migrants, the girls that went 5 stepped in touch, and it was the reverse for boys. You know, so boys were much more likely to disappear into the ether once they emigrated.
Yeah. Well, and look at the types of jobs too. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
depending on the time, they might be a soldier in the Civil War. That might be no good to you if you get killed. I mean, and we have stories of the Irish parents trying to track down pensions, you know, but it was difficult to prove all that, and if they are illiterate.
Yeah.
Whereas the girl would go and she'd be a maid and she could save her money and send it home. It's amazing.
She'd live in home. Yeah, we've one collection actually that if people are interested and they're ever visiting Dublin, there's a wonderful collection in UCD by a young girl called Annie O'Donnell, who emigrated in 1901, I think it was, from Spiddal, and she fell in love with a young boy on the boat on the way over, and they were separated for the first 4 years while she worked as a servant, actually in the Mellon household, so a very well-known family. And she wrote to him for the 4 years, and all the letters survive, and they're wonderful, and they were donated to the library by her son, who became a priest actually, and who studied in UCD for a while. So they're in the UCD library, but they're beautiful love letters, and I use them for teaching because she talks about going to America, and they're separated, as I say, for the 4 years, and they marry at the end of that 4 years, not having seen each other since that short spell on the boat. But she tells him after a couple of months, "No, you won't believe me. I look so fantastic. I'm so fat." And my students find this fascinating, that for her, the definition of success was that she'd put on weight. And all of my students are like, "Oh." And the other thing that I thought was really, hungry. Yeah. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is the kisses, the X's and zeros. They use them. I thought that was a modern affection. So she starts the kisses about 6 months into the letter. She starts putting kisses at the end, and then they go all over the page. You know, like a modern. So young people really relate to her. She was only 19 when she left, so she was very young. And interestingly, she went back home to Spiddal. She donated lots of money for the church, and she brought it back to Spiddal because she wanted her parents to meet her children. She had 2 children at the time, and she went back. And her second child, while in Ireland, died of diphtheria, but actually saved her life and her other child's life because she was due to return on the Titanic. And she missed it. God. Yeah. So it's a fascinating story. Yeah. It's a fascinating story. Yeah.
So I'm just checking. Sorry, Robin said, what was the average salary? So I think you did answer that for an Irish immigrant once they immigrated. Once they immigrated, sorry. Over here in America.
That's interesting. I mean, they reckon, we had the research on that is patchy, but they reckon that they were earning up to 2 and 3 times the amount they could earn at home. And they were also treated, like they were also more likely to kind of have better standard of food and everything in the houses that they lived in. So, and you have a lot of girls saying, well, I'd rather be a bridie in an interesting place than stay at home and like have to, whenever I have my spare time, I've got to return home and do washing and clean my mother's house. Whereas when I'm in the States, and that was a really big thing when these young women were in the States, then they did have their afternoon off, which sometimes they actually could have an afternoon off. So I think for some of them, it was an adventure, and it was a way of getting away from drudgery. But interestingly, they did go on to have as large families. So, for example, Annie O'Donnell, who lamented her own mother's quality of life in Spiddal, went on to have 12 children herself and gave, I think, 6 or 8 of them to the church.
Oh, crikey.
So, you know, there was a huge fidelity.
Cycles die hard.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that the Irish attachment to the large family is really interesting because it endures for quite a long time, and it can't be explained purely by Catholicism, because even if you look, although the Protestant birth rate did decline before the Catholic, it was still much bigger than the average outside. So there's something about that family kind of idea that goes beyond economic. I mean, it was hugely economic for a lot of people, but it's also cultural. There was something cultural about the larger family that died really hard, and really didn't change until the 1980s, 1990s. I think it's the 1990s actually when you have the first huge drop.
Right. Yeah, sure. I mean, my parents, I'm one of 4, you know, whereas my sister has 3. Both. The other one is pregnant. She'll be having her 3rd. So, you know, I was going to say, I can't remember who wrote it, Lindsay, but there's this paper called The Fanula Factor.
That was Maureen Murphy who donated.
Was it Maureen?
She's the woman. She's the woman who got the letters, the Annie O'Donnell letters for us.
Yeah, because she talks about,
Yeah,
I think it was Singh that met
yeah,
two girls on a train, and the one girl, I think they were both Kerry or maybe Galway, but one girl like had the shawl on and was barefoot and never made eye contact and yes sir, no sir, and the other girl, the sister, had come back from America and was bold kind of and confident, and I think that he said in that she said herself she's going to go back, like that this was driving
yeah,
her crazy. She'd come home with money thinking she could buy like a little shop for herself
yeah.
or something, but she couldn't be dealing with the kind of the
Well, they didn't accept it. Yeah, you come back with your back
exactly, like
money.
she was too independent and she didn't want to be held down, so she was going back to America.
Well, it's interesting
It was,
because you have cases in the trial, murder trials, and there's more than one or two cases where a woman returns with a dowry for herself and marries up, but it causes tension in the family and results in a murder. I mean, so it really disrupted communities. They didn't like someone coming back with money that kind of allowed them raise themselves out of their status. So it was very hard for people to come back. They for lots of reasons, not just financial. Very few you returned successfully, certainly prior to the 1960s.
Well, and I think that, looking at it from our side here, the Irish Americans, it is odd, in ways that like some people lose contact. Like even some of our own members, it's 2 or 3 generations out. A few of them, their grandparents or parents were Irish and now they're in their 60s, but a lot of them, like it's 3 maybe back and there is no contact with people in Ireland, and you wonder, was it that first generation that kind of resented having to go in the first place, or then maybe not being made welcome.
It's amazing how quickly familial memory is lost. That's one thing as well that I find interesting looking at those military service pensions, that by the generation of the children, they don't know the details of their own father's death, even if they died in really glorious military circumstances. So it's really interesting how quickly that gets lost. And I suppose
that because we don't talk about the hard stuff?
Yeah, and I think also if you think about the size of Irish families, and then you go on and have your own, you want to have 12 and 13, and you don't want to be keeping in touch with people who may be asking you for money when you're just about keeping it. And because that was one thing that was interesting, because what she was talking about when she mentioned the Fionnuala factor was that women were the greatest source of other women's emigration. So one sister would send for the other, which was the Fionnuala factor. If you got rid of one girl, you could fund the next 2 from that girl's wages, because she'd want her sister to follow out and she'd be encouraging. But Annie O'Donnell, it appears her sister had gone many years ahead of her because there were so many children. And when she went out to meet up with her, I think it was in Philadelphia, but I'm not sure where she lands initially. Maybe it wasn't actually. But anyway, the sister was very cold to her and made it very clear that she needed to find a job ASAP and get out, and she didn't maintain contact with the sister. She became really close friends with another servant in the household who was English and who stayed in contact with her to her death and was the godmother to one of her children. So she created an American family, really.
And you can see that, throughout not only, I suppose, even immigrants today, to be honest, you have to sometimes start again, kind of
another community of people who need also other people. Like, for example, this English woman didn't have any family in America either, so needed her as much as she needed them, so I think that's quite interesting. But one of some of the letters that are in that collection from Byrne are migrants who get stuck, for example, in the crash, so are out in America and then lose everything, or in Australia indeed, and need to be returned.
Well, and I saw some of that here in archives, and actually I was thinking about it. There was one woman, she was in her 60s, she was a servant for a family, and she had left Ireland when she was 15 or 16. This was maybe the late 1800s, and they had taken it upon themselves like to repatriate her back to Roscommon because the family didn't need her. There was no pension scheme for maids, kind of thing. And I was thinking, Jesus, like, who are you sending this woman back in the 60s, like, to Roscommon, where maybe she doesn't know anyone anymore? And they were doing it, like, I thought that was awful. Robin asks as well, was there a tax or a percentage taken out of the amount sent home? I wouldn't think.
No,
I think if you repatriated money, you could,
no, it wasn't. It's a very good question, though, but no. And the remittance money was huge. The boost to the economy was really, really phenomenal. I mean, I know that Dave Fitzpatrick did a kind of translation, and it came close to a third of GDP. I mean, and this was women. It was predominantly women. I mean, I think it's really interesting historically because, women really were at the source of money all the time. So if you even look at the revolution, they were the ones raising the money. That's what Cumann na Món were doing. That's what all these organizations were doing. And indeed, it was religious sisters too, who were really phenomenal in raising money for migrants, and actually often those charitable organizations that worked with failed migrants, if you like, or migrants who came upon hard times, were often, female religious. So, and likewise, like you say, a lot of those nuns would be first generation Irish and sent back by the convent too.
Yeah, wow. When they were
two families that were like, well, who's your one? Like, there wouldn't be anybody in living memory who'd know that person. And so now there was a
burden on them, like, because there was very little to go
around.
Megan says, it seems to me this may have taken the pressure off Ireland, right, to make life affordable because so much money is in. Oh, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the whole state, though, like, it's only kind of now, I think, that we're in the last 10 years that we're looking at, independence wasn't the glory, that we all thought it was, kind of thing.
And they were quite cynical.
Yeah.
They were quite cynical about the migrants, Megan. I mean, they talk the talk about, once we have freedom, nobody will leave our shores. But in fact, one of the revolutionary survivors, Des Fitzgerald, the father of Garrett Fitzgerald, who was a very big politician in Ireland in the 1970s and 80s, he commented on the fact that the last thing we want are all these Irish people to come back, because they come back with their ideas, expecting and wanting stuff we're not going to provide. So they were aware that really, they were getting rid of a lot of young people who might cause trouble if this state was not providing work for them, and B, these people were just returning money. So there was no incentive to change or to modernize until that stops. I really do think J.J. Lee once said that was the biggest kind of slowdown in modernizing Ireland, was that here they could behave in really uneconomic, ineffective ways and get funded by a diaspora that they had effectively rejected.
Yeah.
So it's
export was our people, like,
and some of the cases are really sad. Some of the I just examined a superb PhD coming out of Oxford, and it's a woman who looked at Irish women migrating to New York between 1850 and 1900, and she basically knocks on the head some of the male historians, and she says, not only did these women have a huge impact financially, but it was a female city, and it was an Irish female city in New York at that time. But she looks at someone, she in order to track, she asked a fundamental question: at what point do we ask in a migrant's life, was emigration a good decision? Do we ask within the first couple of years, the second couple of years? Do we ask in old age? And I thought it was a really interesting thing, at what point do we say it was a success? And so she tracks how these women do until their death. And she says she looks at them through their life cycle. And a third of them ended up in some kind of an institution because there was nobody to care for them. So it was really quite,
in America.
Yeah. Oh, really quite sad. And, and they might have been successful temporarily because they earn more money, but if they didn't manage to either find a breadwinner and set up a family of their own, if they stayed single, they were in real trouble. And they were more likely, the only other kind of ethnic group that was as likely to them as to have to work in old age and could end up in an institution were Black women. Which is interesting. All other ethnic groups were much more likely to take care of their older women within the family structure and not leave those women dependent on institutional help.
Well, and I'd say Italian and German and Jewish women were maybe more likely to marry too. That is the danger, that if you're staying single, you're in trouble. That's a note to myself. Keep moving.
That or donate a lot to the church, so they're there for you when you need them.
I'm afraid that ship has sailed. I'm sure my aunts and nuns did all that. So look, I'm sorry to keep you so late, but this was fascinating. I think we could have talked all night. Great from our audience. There's no other questions. We've asked them all. Bob says thank you so much. He said he's constantly fascinated by learning about Irish and Irish America. I think it's so great, Dr. Earner-Byrne, to have somebody like you, because it is just shifting the focus. Like, we knew some of this story, or we certainly had access to the archives, and so to be able to twist it and see from the other point, and
well, I am very happy to come back at some point in a year or so and talk to you about the military stuff, because that's really interesting. When I've worked through some of that, I'll come back and talk to you about it, because that's another story. I think that's just about that we're just getting a
like the men, we can recite it, off the top of our tongues. But
and these are people that are disappointed with the state. So it's kind of interesting, because they're not talking about the church now; they're talking about the state. And I think the states got off the hook, you know.
Oh yeah, big time.
And the
And
churches
rightly, we have
got
to have a look
blamed.
at the
Yeah,
Constitution and stuff, you know, yeah.
yeah.
So
But
we have
anyway,
that to
listen,
look
I
forward
would
to.
lovely, looking forward to seeing New York in the flesh soon. But
Good. Oh yeah,
keep
do.
safe,
You have to come home
everybody,
if
and
you do.
yes,
And we
let's
never
hope
heard your
the
dog, so that was
yeah,
good.
no, she was so good. She was just
Yeah.
quiet.
They
All right.
appreciate your time. Thank
See
you.
you.
And so if anyone does want to contact
Yeah,
me,
email
maybe,
me.
or, you know, I can give you the address, or exactly just look up Dr.
More
Earner-Byrne.
than
She's
happy to
teaching at
take
University
queries at
College
any time.
Cork.
And if you're ever in UCC, rock on up and knock
Yeah,
on the
good.
door.
It's a great school. And I should remind people, we're going down, if you're in Albany or the surrounding area, we're going down to Broadway next Wednesday, the 8th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, to go to see a matinee performance of Larry Kerwin's new 10 Tony Award nominations. He's written a musical about the Irish and African Americans in 5 points called Paradise Square. It's going to be brilliant. So set your in
I
the
heard
school
it's
for.
amazing. I envy you all that.
Yeah, I'm excited. So there's
Right.
tickets available on our website at irish-us.org. And thank you very much, Dr. Byrne. That was really impressive, and we'll definitely have you back.
Yeah. No, talk to you.
Care.
Bye.